The servants' passage behind the east staircase at Ashcroft House ran narrow and cold, even in April, lit by a single tallow candle in a tin holder screwed to the plaster. Nell Barrow had walked it 100 times without looking up. She looked up now. The man in the brown coat had been standing at the far end for perhaps 3 seconds before she registered him, and in those 3 seconds he had already placed himself so that the passage had only one exit, and she was not near it. He was large in the way of men who had done rough work young and then been given a wage to do rougher work indoors. His hat was on. No footman in any house she had served would have kept his hat on in a servant's passage. She did not know his name. She had learned in the past 10 days that he was employed by Lord Fenwick, that he had been inside Ashcroft House twice before on the pretext of delivering messages, and that on both occasions objects had been moved in the late Lord Ashcroft's private rooms. She knew all of this the way she knew most things, by watching, by the body's patient attention to detail she could not write down, and had therefore learned to carry in her hands and her posture, an arrangement that served her well enough. She was not a clever girl, they said. She could not read, and a girl who could not read was a girl with a ceiling, and the ceiling was below stairs where she had always lived. She had accepted this as she accepted cold passage walls and second-hand shoes, accepted without joy and without complaint. The letter was in her apron pocket. It had been there for 11 days, since the hour Mrs. Pugh died in the housekeeper's room, with the packet pressed into Nell's hands and a breath that smelled of camphor and apology. "Keep it safe," the old woman had said. "Do not give it to anyone who asks." Nell had pressed the wax seal with her thumb, tracing a device she could not read and a name she could not decipher, and put the whole of it in her apron pocket, and it had been there so long now it was warm from her body, warmer than the passage air. The man in the brown coat took a step toward her. Behind her, at the far end of the passage, a door opened. She heard the change in air before she heard the step, a breath of cold from the courtyard side, and then a single footfall on stone that had a different quality from the man's. She turned. He was tall, and still in the way that rooms become still before something important happens inside them. He wore a dark coat and no hat, which meant he had come in from somewhere without thinking about decorum, which meant he had come quickly. His face was angled toward the man in the brown coat, not toward her, and his face in that moment was the color and texture of winter stone. She did not know his name either. She had served at Lady Ashcroft's dinner 3 nights before, and he had been at the table, and she had not been able to make her eyes leave his profile for longer than it was safe, which was a problem she had not had before, and did not know the word for. He said very quietly, without raising his voice, "She is mine to protect. Touch her again and answer to me." The man in the brown coat looked at him for a long moment. Then he put his hat on straighter, turned, and walked out through the courtyard door. And the cold came in behind him and died. She stood in the passage with the letter in her apron pocket, her heart loud in her ears, and did not say anything. He turned to her at last. His eyes were dark, and they were not cold, and she did not yet know what to do with that. Nell Barrow had come to Ashcroft House in February on the recommendation of a village parson who had known the late housekeeper's cousin, which was the kind of appointment that held no glamour and no promise of advancement. She had been grateful anyway. She had grown up in a hamlet in Wiltshire with her grandmother, who had kept a cottage garden and died in the autumn before last, and after that there was nothing to stay for, and nowhere to stay. She was 22 years old, and she had been in service since she was 15, in houses that grew gradually larger as her references accumulated and her hands grew steadier. She had never learned to read. This was not for want of will. It was for want of time and teacher, and most particularly, for want of anyone who believed the lesson would take. Her grandmother had been illiterate. The village had a parson with good intentions and too many parishioners. The households she served did not pay her to read. They paid her to fold linens and braid hair and carry things from one floor to another without breaking them. She had learned to compensate. She had an excellent memory. She listened with the whole of her attention in any room where information was being shared, and she retained it. She recognized patterns in text, the long loop that began lady, the short cluster at the end of a word that her eye had learned to associate with the sound she heard spoken. She was not simple. She had been told often enough that she had learned to hold her face still when the telling happened, which was its own kind of intelligence. Mrs. Pugh had been the Ashcroft House housekeeper for 31 years and had kept the late Lord Ashcroft's private correspondence organized with the same attention she gave to the silver cupboard. When she fell ill in February, she began the slow work of putting things in order. And when she understood in early April that the order would need to be someone else's problem, she had pressed the packet into Nell's hands specifically because Nell could not read it. That was the thing that had taken Nell 3 days to understand. Mrs. Pugh had not made a mistake. She had chosen Nell for exactly that reason. A girl who cannot read, the old woman had said, closing her eyes, cannot be made to tell anyone what she knows. The packet held a single letter on thick paper, folded 3 times and sealed. The wax was old. The device in it meant nothing to Nell's eye. She had held it up to the candle and studied the seal as if it might speak, and it did not speak. And she put it back in her pocket and went about her work. Lady Ashcroft had begun looking for something the week after Mrs. Pugh died. Nell noted the change in the household's weather the way she noted rain before it arrived, first as a pressure, and then as a direction. The late Lord's study was aired twice when it had not been aired in months. A footman was set to cataloguing the library. Lady Ashcroft herself walked the first floor in the mornings with a manner that suggested movement, but covered very little ground, the slow circuit of someone who is looking without being seen to look. She was not an unkind woman. She was a frightened one, which is a different thing, and in some ways a more dangerous one. She had spoken to Nell once directly in the early days of March, when Nell had been in the wrong corridor at the wrong moment with a pile of pressed linens. She had looked at Nell with eyes that assessed and dismissed in a single pass, and she had said to Mrs. Trent, who was standing at her elbow, that the new girl seemed to manage well enough, and she was glad someone did, because the households ran on people who could be trusted not to complicate things. Mrs. Trent had nodded. Then Lady Ashcroft had added, in a lower voice that she perhaps did not intend to carry, that it was fortunate the new girl could not read. A letter found by a girl who understood its contents would be very different trouble. Nell had been 4 steps past the corridor's bend when the words arrived. She had not stopped walking. She had pressed the flat of her palm against her apron pocket once, briefly, and gone upstairs. If you have ever been told you cannot understand the thing you are currently holding, you will know what Nell felt then. It was not precisely anger. It was something older than anger, the specific and patient weight of having been measured with the wrong instrument and found wanting by the measuring. She did not give the letter to anyone. Lord Whitmore arrived at Ashcroft House on a Thursday, 3 days before Lord Fenwick's man first appeared in the East Passage. He came on a social call that was technically appropriate, having known the late Lord Ashcroft through his father's house in Derbyshire, and Lady Ashcroft received him in the drawing-room with the careful warmth she extended to men of good family and clear standing. He was the Viscount Whitmore of Derbyshire. He was 34 years old, with dark hair that sat close to his head, and eyes that Nell, passing with the tea-tray, had to look at twice before she understood they were gray rather than black. because gray in that face had the quality of very old stone, permanent and full of weather. He stood when she entered. No gentleman needed to stand for a maid carrying a tray. He stood anyway, and she nearly stopped, and did not. She poured the tea with her hands exactly steady, which cost her something, because he was watching, not looking, which was how most people in drawing rooms watched servants, that diffuse not quite seeing that permitted them to receive the cup without acknowledging the hand that delivered it. He was watching, which was a specific thing, an attentive and registering thing, and she felt it on the side of her face, like proximity to a candle flame. She set down the tray and left the room, and stood in the corridor for one full breath with her hand against the doorframe. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself this in the voice she had learned to use for things that were difficult to carry. The grandmother's cottage locked up and sold to a stranger. The first winter of service when she had been so cold and so lonesome, she had held her own hand in the dark to have something to hold. She was good at telling herself things. She went back to her work. He came to dinner twice more that week. Each time she served at table, she placed herself where she could not easily see his face, which meant she spent both dinners acutely aware of exactly which chair he occupied, the way you know where the fire is in a dark room without looking at it. On the second evening, rising from the table, he passed close enough that she caught his sleeve with the edge of the water jug she was carrying. She said, in a low voice, "I beg your pardon, my lord." And he said, "Not at all." And for a moment his hand was near her arm, near enough that she felt the air between his fingers and her sleeve, as something with substance, and then it moved away, and she stepped back, and they were two people in a dining room who had briefly shared a corridor of attention, and now did not. She was in the kitchen passage the following morning when she heard it from the garden, his voice low, speaking to the Ashcroft steward about the state of the household's accounts, and underneath the practical exchange she understood, from tone and from the specific words she caught through the stone, that he was not here to settle a social debt. He was looking for something. He was looking, she would later understand, for the same thing Lady Ashcroft was looking for, and Lord Fenwick had sent his man to find. She did not understand this yet. What she understood was that he looked for things carefully, and that he was not satisfied with what he had been told, and that a man who looked carefully was a different kind of man from the one she had been trained to expect. The following afternoon she was in the kitchen passage collecting hot water for the upstairs rooms when she heard the accusation. It came in the voice of Mr. Hensley, the Ashcroft butler, raised to its formal pitch, announcing that young Alice, the second kitchen girl of 14, had taken 18 pence from the housekeeping tin. Alice was standing with her back against the scullery door, and her face gray with the understanding of what a dismissed character would mean, which was everything and then nothing afterward. Nell had not planned what she did next. She set down the ewer, opened her own small purse, and counted out 18 pence onto the kitchen table with her hands perfectly steady, because the only argument available to a girl in her position was to cost herself the thing she could not afford to lose. She said to Mr. Hensley that she believed the money had been mislaid, and that she was glad to make it right. She said it without looking at Alice, so Alice would not see pity in her face. Because pity was a thing that sometimes turned the person receiving it into a smaller version of themselves than they had been before it arrived. She did not know that Lord Whitmore was standing at the kitchen passage doorway. She did not know what she looked like from that vantage, which was a woman in a plain apron with a ewer set at her feet, counting coins in a kitchen where the fire had burned down to its afternoon embers and the smell of bread still hung in the cold air. She knew only that Alice had not been dismissed, and that 18 pence was a fortnight's saving for her, and that it was worth it. She picked up the ewer and went back to her work. She learned it 40 minutes later from the housemaid Dorothea who had seen him there and seen his face, and who reported this to Nell as gossip of the ordinary kind. Nell received it as gossip of the ordinary kind. She folded the information into the back of her attention and went about her evening. And only later, lying awake in the dark with her hand against her apron pocket, did she allow herself to wonder what his face had held. She did not permit herself to wonder what that meant. She was a maid who could not read. She had a letter in her pocket she did not understand. She was the wrong person in the wrong position for wondering about anything except how to get through the week without losing the things she had been trusted to keep. His wound came to her in pieces. She did not ask for it. She gathered it the way she gathered most knowledge. From the spaces between things said and the specific quality of a silence, Mrs. Trent had mentioned once to the cook that the Viscount's family had known grief. A sister, she had said, and no more, the sentence closing itself with a look that meant the grief was the kind that did not welcome speculation. Later, serving in the drawing room, Nell had caught 3 words from a conversation between Lady Ashcroft and an elderly caller, the name Eliza Holt. The name had been lowered at the moment of speaking, which was the social register reserved for deaths and disgraces, and the older woman had shaken her head with the particular rhythm of someone remembering a thing they wished they could unmember. 6 years ago, she gathered, London had decided something about Eliza Holt, and then London had moved on to deciding something about the next person, and she had gone somewhere cold and not come back from it. There was a letter involved, as she gathered from the steward one evening, who was old enough to be careless near the kitchen stairs. A forged document, false debts, a manufactured ruin. She had gathered these pieces and held them in the same hands that held the letter in her apron pocket. A man whose sister had been killed by a piece of paper would know what a piece of paper could do. That was the thought she allowed herself, once, in the specific tense quiet of 3 a.m. Then she put it away and went back to work. If you have never been what she was in that house, below stairs, below trust, below the threshold of anyone's interest in your well-being, you may not understand why the next 3 days felt like a city wall closing inward. She did not have the language for what was happening, because no one had given her the language. She only had the feeling, which was the feeling of a space running out of room. Lord Fenwick's man appeared on a Monday. He was in the kitchen passage by Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, he had been in the corridor outside the housekeeper's room twice, and each time Nell passed him, he looked at her the way a man looks at a locked drawer, not with cruelty, but with calculation, which was in some ways worse. On Wednesday afternoon, in the East Passage, he blocked her path. Lady Ashcroft's voice had come to her the evening before, through the wall of the sitting room, raised past its usual restraint. And Nell had heard it plainly. She cannot even read. Mrs. Trent. The girl cannot read. She will not understand what she holds. And later, when the sitting room was quiet, she heard Lady Ashcroft say something she was not meant to hear either. Something about the 4 houses, about what would be owed to whom, about whether any of them would survive a season's paper. Nell had pressed her back against the passage wall and breathed in the cold, and understood that she was standing inside a question whose shape she could not see, because she could not read the document that defined it. And 2 days after that, on a Thursday, she had been walking to the linen room, when she passed the open door of the steward's sitting room, and heard the voice of a man she did not know say, very pleasantly, that the girl who couldn't read her letters was the last person anyone would think to search, which was the only reason she was still holding what she was holding. Nell had paused in the doorway for the length of a breath. She could not see who was speaking. She heard Lord Whitmore answer with a silence that had a very particular quality, not agreement, but something tightening against it. She had not given the letter to anyone. She had also not known until that moment that Lord Whitmore knew she had it. She went about her work for the rest of the day with the methodical care of someone who has understood that the ground beneath them is no longer what it appeared to be. She was a girl who could not read. She could not read the document that had been given into her keeping. She could not read the situation she was inside. She could not read the faces of the people who wanted the thing she carried, except that she could, because she had always been able to read faces, and faces told her plainly she did not know what she held, which meant she was safe only so long as she stayed unknown. And in the East Passage on a Thursday afternoon, a man put his hat on and stepped toward her, and she understood that the safety was over. If you have stood in a passage with your back to a wall and understood that no one will come, you know what Nell felt in the space before the courtyard door opened. She felt the letter in her apron pocket, and the weight of the thing she had carried for 11 days, and the specific familiar weight of being the girl who could be overlooked because she could not read, and she thought of the 11 days she had held it without anyone telling her a thing, and that she was still holding it, and that the only reason she was still holding it was because everyone had believed she did not know what she had. And then the door opened, and Lord Whitmore was there. He did not hurry after the man left. He stood in the passage and looked at her with eyes that held something she had not expected from a man of his station, which was consideration. Not the consideration of a lord for a useful object, but the consideration of someone deciding how much truth a person can bear, and then deciding to offer more than the standard allowance. He said, "Miss Barrow." Just that. Her name in his voice was the first time anyone in that house had spoken her name as if it were a specific and complete address, not merely a category. She said, "Yes, my lord." He said, "I know what you are carrying. I am not here to take it from you. I am asking, if you will permit it, whether you would let me read it to you." She stood very still. The passage was cold, and the tallow candle threw a small, uncertain light, and she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, which was a thing she had not been aware of until this moment. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you have carried it for 11 days without knowing what it said, and that seems to me a thing that should be corrected. And because what is in that letter concerns a woman who was wronged 17 years ago, and who is still alive and still waiting. And because you have as much right to know what you have been protecting as anyone in this house." She put her hand against her apron pocket. The letter was warm. It was always warm from her body now. She looked at him for a long moment in the tallow light, that jaw like old stone, those gray eyes, the hand that had been near her arm twice and withdrawn itself twice, and she thought of Mrs. Pugh pressing the packet into her hands, and of Alice's gray face, and of 18 pence counted out on a kitchen table. She reached into her pocket and held the letter out. He took it with both hands, carefully, as though it were something that had been handled well and deserved to continue to be handled well. He broke the seal without hesitation, a quick and clean motion, and he unfolded the paper, and he read it aloud in the passage, in a voice that was low and clear and did not hurry. She listened. The words came to her the way rain comes, first as individual drops, then as something that covers everything at once. She did not follow every phrase. The legal structure of it was beyond her current vocabulary. She followed the names, however, and followed them very well. 4 lords, named in order. A widow defrauded of her Berkshire estate 17 years ago. A date of agreement among 4 men in a private club. The late Lord Ashcroft's hand recording it in black ink because he had been there, and because in the last years of his life the record had seemed to him the only decent thing left he could do. She said nothing for a long time after he finished reading. He said, "I intend to give this to a solicitor, not to burn it. A solicitor for the widow, Mrs. Eleanor Forsyth, who was 71 years old and living in a single let room in Bath. She is the only one in this story who has been waiting without any power to change anything." She looked at him. She said, "And the 4 houses? They will be diminished," he said. "That is different from destroyed. I have no interest in ruin for its own sake. I have a great deal of interest in Mrs. Forsyth's estate being returned to her while she is still alive to walk on it." She thought of the Viscount's sister, who had gone somewhere cold and not come back from it. And she thought of a piece of paper that had made that possible. She thought of a piece of paper that had the power to make other things possible. She thought of being the person who had carried it, and what the carrying had cost, and what it might be worth. She said, "Yes, give it to the solicitor." He folded the letter back along its original creases. He put it in his inside coat pocket against his chest, which was where she had kept it in her apron. And she noticed this without knowing what to do with it. Then he said, very quietly, "Miss Barrow, are you all right?" She had been asked this question perhaps 3 times in her life, and each time by someone who was asking it with a practical motive. She considered it now. "I am cold," she said, "and I am glad Mrs. Pugh chose me. And I am glad you read it aloud." He said after a moment, "So am I." She was aware of where he was standing. She had been aware of where he was standing since he had entered the passage, which was closer than a lord typically stood to a maid in a servant's corridor, and not close enough. Her hands were at her sides, and she felt the absence of the letter in her pocket, the way you feel an absence when you have carried something for a long time and set it down, lighter and strange with it, and not entirely relieved. He said, "I find I do not wish to stop speaking to you, Miss Barrow. That is a difficulty I have not known in some years." She looked at him in the tallow light. She said, "My lord." And then she did not say anything else, because there was not a form of address available to her that covered the distance between where they were and where he seemed to be suggesting they might go. And she was a girl who had always managed without language she did not have. He said, "I am not asking anything of you. I am simply telling you a true thing." She said after a long moment, "I have never been told true things by people who did not need something from me." He said, "I know." And he looked at her, and the gray of his eyes in that light was the color of the February morning when she had first arrived at Ashcroft House with one bag and no expectations. And something in that color made her think of doors, and what it meant to have one opened from the outside. She did not move toward him. She did not need to. She simply stood in the passage with her hand against her now empty apron pocket, and understood that this moment had already happened and could not be taken back from the record. And that was enough. The letter went to a solicitor in Gray's Inn the following week, delivered by Lord Whitmore in person with a written account of its provenance that named Mrs. Eleanor Forsyth as the defrauded party and entered the matter into the correct legal record. The 4 proud houses did not collapse. 2 of them contracted considerably over the following year. One of them removed itself to its country estate and became very quiet. The 4th, Lord Fenwick's house, entered a period of negotiation with Mrs. Forsyth's council that lasted through the summer and concluded with the restoration of a portion of the Berkshire estate and a private settlement that permitted no one to use the words ruin or exposed in any public context. Mrs. Forsyth 71 years old, walked on the portion of restored land in September with a cane and the assistance of a granddaughter who had never seen her cry before. Lady Ashcroft was not destroyed either. She was corrected, which in some ways was harder. She sat in her drawing room in early May and received Lord Whitmore, who told her what he had done and why, and she listened with her hands in her lap and her face very still. And she did not argue. She said, at the end, that she had not known the widow existed until her husband was dying, and that she had spent 4 months trying to protect people who did not deserve it as much as Mrs. Forsyth did. This was the most honest thing anyone in that house had said aloud in years, and Nell, who was outside the drawing-room door with a tray she had forgotten she was holding, heard it, and held it with the same careful hands she had used for everything else. The offer came through the Ashcroft housekeeper in the first week of May, before the season fully opened and the household's rhythms shifted toward the particular exhaustion of spring. Lord Whitmore's townhouse in Grosvenor Street required a lady's maid for his recently arrived young cousin, Miss Patience Holt, who was 18 and making her debut under his guardianship. The position was a step up from what Nell currently held. The reference that accompanied the offer was written in Lord Whitmore's own hand, which Nell knew because he had told her so, not because she could verify it. She accepted. Miss Patience Holt was small and bright and full of questions, which suited Nell, who had good answers. The townhouse was warm in the evenings, and the kitchen was generous, and Mrs. Denny, the housekeeper, was a woman of the kind Nell had always hoped to work for, precise and fair, and in possession of an excellent memory for the names of the people who worked for her. The library was on the first floor, north-facing, smelling of beeswax and old paper, and the specific dust of books that had been moved and replaced hundreds of times. She had not gone into it. It was not her room. He found her at the foot of the library stairs on a Wednesday evening in the second week of May, when the household was quiet and Miss Patience was in bed, and the candles in the upper hall were down to their last half-inch. He was carrying a book, and he had his coat off, which meant he had been reading for some time and had not expected to find anyone on the stairs. He said, "Miss Barrow." She said, "My lord, I beg your pardon. I was only checking the candles." He said, "I know." And then he said, "Will you come in a moment?" She should have said no. She said yes. The library was warm from the day's accumulated light through the north window. The fire banked low. He set down his book and stood at the window for a moment with his hands behind his back, and she stood near the door with hers at her sides. And there was between them the specific silence of two people who have already said the important thing and are now managing the aftermath. He turned. He said, "I have been considering how to ask you something for the better part of a fortnight." She waited. He said, "You have been carrying things that were too heavy, in houses that did not tell you the truth, for all of your working life. I am aware that I am a person of a class that has in general been responsible for a portion of that." He paused. "I am also aware that what I am about to say may not be welcome, and I am asking you to tell me plainly if that is the case." She said, "Ask it." He picked up a small volume from the desk. He held it out. It was thin, with a cloth cover, the kind of book that looked less like literature and more like an instrument. She could see that there were letters on the cover that she could not read. He said, "I would like to teach you, if you will let me. 2 evenings a week when the household permits. There is nothing I can offer you that you do not already deserve by your own quality. But there is one thing that has been kept from you that I am in a position to give." He set the book on the corner of the desk. "That is the whole of it. The rest is yours to decide." She looked at the book. She looked at him. She thought of Mrs. Pugh's hands pressing the packet into hers, and the wax seal she had studied in the candle's light without being able to make it speak, and the letter read aloud in the East Passage in a voice that did not hurry. She said, "Yes." He sat down at the desk. He sat. He pulled his chair at an angle so that she could stand at the corner and see the page without their being improperly close, which was a consideration she had not expected and which made her throat tight in a way she did not have a name for. He opened the book to the first page, where the alphabet was arranged in its plain and ancient order. He said, "Begin here," and pointed and said a sound. She repeated it. He said, "Again," and his voice was very low, and the fire was very quiet, and the candle on the desk threw its small circle around them both. She repeated it again. Across the city that night, in a solicitor's office in Gray's Inn, a letter sat in a sealed case with a new wax seal bearing the solicitor's device. The red of the original seal was gone now, broken and put away. The paper held what it had always held: 4 names, 1 widow, 1 act of recorded conscience from a man who had not been brave enough to be honest until his life was nearly finished. It would go before a master in chancery in June, and the matter would be decided in the way that such matters are decided, slowly and procedurally, and without drama, in a room full of men who wore wigs and spoke in Latin. Her counsel had been to see her in Bath, and she had sat very straight in her single let room and said that she had waited 17 years and could wait until June without difficulty. The letter had been warm once, from the body of a girl who could not read it. It was cool now in its official case, and would be read by men who read things all day. Something had passed out of it and into the world it described, and the world it described was slowly, procedurally changing. In the library in Grosvenor Street, Nell said the sound a second time, and then a third, and then Lord Whitmore pointed to the second letter and said its sound, and she said that one too. The alphabet was 26 steps. She did not need to reach the end of it tonight. She only needed to begin, and she had begun. She stood at the corner of the desk with her hands clasped in front of her and the candle making a small warm world of the page. And outside the window the city was doing what cities do at midnight in April, which is moving and murmuring and not attending to any particular pair of people in any particular lighted room. And she felt it. Not triumph, which was too loud a word, but something that had the quality of a door standing open and the night air coming through it, clean and possible. He said the third letter. She said it back. She was aware of the fire and the candle and the particular quiet of a house whose inhabitants had all gone to sleep, and the way that quiet put a border around the two of them and the small circle of light on the page. She was aware of his hand near the book, not near her, not reaching, simply present. She was aware that she was learning something she had wanted to know since she was 8 years old, and had watched a village girl read aloud from a parish notice, and had felt the wanting as a physical thing, a hollow in the chest. His voice in the quiet room was the sound of a man who was staying, and she was the reason he was staying. And she let herself know this without putting it into words she did not yet have. The candle burned down 1/2 inch before either of them thought to look at it, and by then the alphabet had its first 5 letters in her voice, and she had not once looked away from the page. If you have carried something for 11 days in your apron pocket, warm from your body, not knowing what it said, you will understand the specific quality of setting it down. You do not feel immediately lighter. You feel the shape of what you were carrying as an absence. The absence fills slowly with the knowledge of what you held and what it was worth and what it has become. The letter had been warm. The library was warm. The fire in the grate was a low red gold, the kind of fire that does not announce itself, only persists. She said the fourth letter, and the fifth, and then stopped because he was looking at her, not at the page, and she met his eyes in the candlelight, and neither of them looked away. If you stayed until the end of this story, leave the one moment that stayed with you in the quiet of the comments. There is more to come.